I'm Dr. Karl, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. G'day, Dr. Karl, Shirtloads of Science, University of Sydney, talking with my go-to person on dietetics. Hey, have a guess who that is? Professor Clare Collins. Welcome, Professor Clare.
Yeah, my great pleasure to be here, Dr. Karl.
And you are messing with my mind by putting two words together that I've never put together in my whole life. And it's not Gila Monster, which we will be talking about, but food noise? Now, I don't know if this is true before we get to the Gila Monster, but I heard recently on a podcast somewhere, which is possibly true, that for the first time in history, just a few months ago, we passed a barrier where for the first time ever, more people died from too much food than from too little food, from starvation. Does that sound kind of reasonable, that obesity has now become more of a killer than starvation?
That sounds about right, and quite a tragic milestone to meet. But let's talk about this new phenomenon of food noise.
Food noise. And I foolishly mentioned the Gila Monster, so we should get the Gila Monster out of the way.
Okay, you tell us about the Gila Monster,
okay,
and then I'm going to tell you about food noise.
Please. Believe it or not, audience, in some cases, take weight loss drugs can make mice give up alcohol, humans give up gambling addictions, so stay in tune. So it begins with science, where sometimes you go looking for something. I want to find a better equivalent of something like aspirin, or I'm just going to go looking at what nature has, what's there, whether it's physics or biochemistry. And so a scientist, a young gastroenterologist in 1980, Jean-Pierre Ruffman, R-A-U-F-M-A-N, was just hanging around and he was trying to learn science, and he ran into another scientist, John Pisano, who loved to chase up peptides in animal venoms. And so animal venoms have to be sort of potent because you've got a creature trying to attack another creature. And they got something from a creature called a Gila Monster. And amazingly, they were testing all the chemicals that they could find, these various chemicals from reptiles, just random chemicals. They were testing them on, wait for it, pancreatic cells from guinea pigs. So you're thinking, pancreas, isn't that related to insulin? Yes. So they found a desert reptile called the Gila Monster, which is sort of like a slow-moving, half-metre long, 10-kilogram creature in the southern deserts of the USA. And they found a chemical that took us down the pathway leading to semaglutide. So I'll just stop now. That led to these, which they called extendins, and say it to me.
That's a nice segue to talking about the new medications. I think everyone's heard of Ozempic now, but semaglutide is actually the active name of the drug that's in Ozempic. And when it's sold for weight loss only, it's called Wegovy. It goes up to a slightly higher dose, but the active drug is the same. But you're absolutely right. The origins of discovering that drug was observing a monster lizard that only needed to eat once a week. And they wondered, how is that possible? And they drilled down and they found this hormone, glucagon-like peptide.
Hang on, so glucagon?
GLP, glucagon.
So it's a chemical that's like something that our pancreas makes. So in our pancreas, we've got the beta cells that make insulin, but we've got the alpha cells that make glucagon. So we found a peptide, which means a short protein. So it's a glucagon-like peptide, and then you shove a one on the end of it.
The drug effect can agonize or extend the action of the body's GLP-1. So that's why it's got the RA on the end. It's a receptor agonist. It basically means it can tickle the receptors in your digestive tract and everywhere else where those receptors are and make them think that the hormone's actually there. So it's quite clever.
Agonist means that it acts like it. So with our own glucagon chemicals, how long do they last for in the bloodstream, and how long do these ones last for?
Well, GLP-1, when you eat, it's a hormone that your body produces to say, hey, you're eating and you're going to stop feeling hungry in a minute. But the half-life of our body's own GLP-1 is 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
2 minutes. But these drug class, these receptor agonists, their half-life is like 170 hours. And the GLP-1, the effect it has on your appetite is it actually makes you not want to eat, basically. That's why these have been investigated to turn them into medications for treating weight loss and diabetes. You mentioned those roles it has in the pancreas. Well, it's also able to improve blood sugar regulation. So they were first discovered because of those blood sugar effects, and then noticed, when people are losing weight, and that was further improving their diabetes. And then there was lots of interest then, well, what about people who have poor weight-related health but without diabetes? So that's why the drive has been to create a version for treating severe obesity in addition to improving blood sugar control for people with diabetes. Yeah, but 170 hours.
Well, what role does insulin have as compared to what role does glucagon have? So they're two different chemicals.
Yeah, different chemicals.
Made in the same organ, the pancreas, which is sort of like a snake running across your belly. What does the insulin do and what does the glucagon do? They're two different chemicals made by two different cells in the same organ. The pancreas, okay.
Yeah, the pancreas has got other jobs. It's a very busy organ. But so when you eat, the amount of glucose, which is just a very simple sugar, goes up in your blood. The pancreas detects this. It's telling your body, hey, there's no point having glucose in your blood. I can't do anything with it. I need it to be in your muscles so that it can power your muscles. And it needs to be in your brain so I can power your brain. So it sends out insulin. You can kind of think of insulin like a big pickup truck. It goes out, gets the glucose, takes it out of the blood vessels to all of the organs that really need glucose to power them, to fuel them.
So during the day, your output of glucose will vary depending on what you're eating. Okay, so the insulin helps the glucose go into where it's needed. So where does glucagon come in?
Glucagon's like a safety brake, essentially. So let's say your blood sugar, you haven't eaten for hours, you've been so busy, and your blood sugar is getting low, low, low. Well, the glucagon says, hang on a minute, you need to give me some more glucose, otherwise all of the body organs aren't going to have any fuel. So glucagon gets released as a reminder to all the spots in your body that are storing up
glycogen.
So the glucagon,
the glucagon, similar name,
forces mostly your muscles and your liver to release the glycogen and turn it into glucose. So your body is happy, your muscles are happy, your brain's happy, your heart, your lungs, all the organs that need to keep on functioning and are dependent on having a fuel source so that you can just carry along on your merry way and your body's working to keep you functioning in the background.
So glucose is a little molecule in a circle with 5 or 6 sides or something like that, a bunch of carbon atoms in a ring and something else, whereas glycogen is a bunch of glucose molecules stacked side by side by side, and it's really easy to build it up so you can store it, and it's really easy to pull it back and break it down into individual ones. Is that roughly right?
Yeah. Kind of think of it like a brick wall. One brick, that's your glucose, but if you had a brick wall, there's your glycogen, and it's a little bit easier to pack those bricks away if you store them neatly. So that's why your body converts it into glycogen, a more efficient storage form of glucose.
So what's the chemical that survives in our bloodstream for just a few minutes?
The GLP.
So we make a chemical called GLP, and then we also make glucagon-like peptide.
Yeah.
Oh my God, we make two different chemicals. One's called glucagon and one's called glucagon-like peptide.
Yeah, that's right. Our bodies are so complex, Karl. This is all important for the regulation of appetite and helping you feel full so that your body knows when to stop eating.
Because we're heading for food noise, aren't we?
We're heading for food noise. So this glucagon-like peptide, when they worked out, oh, wow, we could make drugs out of this and help people improve their health, they were really focused on these satiation, like, oh, I don't feel hungry and I feel full. But then there's a third action that people are reporting that are sort of coming from the people who are using it, where they're saying, when I look at food now, I don't feel hungry. Before, people might have said, I could look at a pizza and whether I was hungry or not, I would eat it. Or they'd go to a shopping centre and see signs for food, eat me, buy me. They're describing it as the food world's gone quiet. They're not reacting to these food cues. Now, scientifically, all the researchers and all the psychology researchers, people are probably going, we've been talking about food cues for ages. But what's interesting is that this information is coming back from people using these drugs, so Ozempic, Wegovy, and there's another one called Mounjaro. They're saying the food world has gone quiet. I have no food noise. It's making it much easier for me when I am feeling hungry to eat healthy food. So food noise for people is like a preoccupation with thinking about food, intrusive thoughts of food that you don't want to be in your head, but they come from when you see signs, when you see advertising, when you hear jingles for, your favorite food. And this is an unintended or an unexpected effect, but it's affecting the brain, which wasn't the reason why the drug was invented or the research was pursued. And so now there's like a wave of research of, well, what's happening?
Originally, the chemicals found in the Gila monster, then used to treat diabetes, then found that it would reduce weight, and then looking more carefully found that it was reducing in the brain this food noise, which is thinking about the food, and especially delicious food and high energy food, or checking the app to see when your next meal or food delivery is coming, or just thinking about your next meal, even though you've just had breakfast, you're thinking about lunch. And all of those are part of this thing we call food noise. And on one hand, I can see that if you look at the 200,000 year history of humans, we've only had agriculture for maybe 10, 15,000 years. Right now, we're in a situation where you're no more than 5 minutes from food. But when we were hunter-gatherers, before agriculture, you might have had to wait an hour or a day. Yeah. So it makes sense in times of scarcity to have the ability to concentrate on food. But now in our plentiful society, we're finding that food noise is too plentiful.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's what the thinking is on why it was a survival advantage, when we were cave people, because you needed to be able to go, oh, there might be food over there, go and look for it, find it, eat it, survive another day. But as you said now, you don't have to do that at all. Between heading off to work and getting to your workplace, you've probably passed 50, 100 opportunities to purchase food, a coffee, a bit of this, a chocolate bar, whatever. And so we're constantly bombarded. And some people's brains genetically are better wired to find food and be responsive to food cues. People who have no food cues at all, they're probably dependent on other people to give them food or to do their meal planning or their meal thinking for them, or they only eat when their stomach is sending them so many messages, it's time to eat. They wouldn't have survived. As we said, in this modern food environment where marketing is, it's a free-for-all, if you have a brain that's very sensitive to food cues, it's very hard for you to resist. And what's interesting about the food cue reactivity, it's independent of hunger. Even if you're not hungry.
If you're not hungry, if a hot pizza comes out of the oven, even though you're full, you will be drawn to by the food cues from our 200,000 years of evolution for most of us, to varying degrees. Because in my vastly extended family, I have a brother-in-law and mother-in-law who every now and then say, I forgot to have lunch. As opposed to, I'm feeling hungry, and they'll just suddenly think, gee, why am I hungry? And it's the end of the day, and they completely forgot to have lunch. And whereas with me, I'm thinking about lunch to some degree, so I've got probably mild food noise, but there are some people who have intense food noise.
And that's described then as a food addiction. One of my colleagues at the University of Newcastle, Professor Tracy Burrows, she does research on people who believe that this preoccupation and intrusion of food noise is so severe that it could be classified as an addiction. And it's a little bit controversial, because it's controversial in the sense of it's unclear whether it's a behavioural addiction, like gambling is a behavioural addiction, or is it that the effect in the brain is chemical dependent and it's more like a drug addiction. But for people living with extreme food noise, it doesn't matter either way, because it's very intrusive and bothersome.
The article that you sent me was called "What is Food Noise? A Conceptual Model of Food Cue Reactivity," published in the journal called Nutrients, Nutrients, and it points out that we make insulin, we make glucagon, we also make glucagon-like peptides, -1, and then the glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonists, or RA, chemicals from outside our body. And in the article it points out that they'll work on your gut to decrease gastric emptying and decrease your glucose absorption, which means that you feel full.
Yeah, so that's the first effect of it. So they actually slow down gastric emptying, so less food is getting into your gastrointestinal tract, or it's getting in at a more measured rate. So your stomach, though, mechanically is fuller for longer. So the first area of action is in slowing down digestion, and so you also feel, this is called satiation, you just feel full. Yeah, so there's the loss of hunger, but then there's the feeling of fullness for longer. So that's a big thing.
So it acts on on the stomach or the GIT to reduce the gastric emptying. So that then via its own internal pathway from the gut up to the brain, then your body says you're full. And then also there's a pancreas effect on the pancreas where it increases your insulin output, which modulates your blood glucose and your appetite.
Yeah, so this was a really important reason why the semaglutide was first released as a drug for diabetes. So it's able to make your body produce more of its own insulin. If you have type 2 diabetes, then this is a really important thing to try and lower your blood sugar. So that was the first reason for getting these drugs on the market, to improve blood sugar control.
Now we come for the third thing, which is, so we've gone past the effect on the gut, the big tube, and the pancreas, which feeds into it. The third one is on the central nervous system and does it cross the blood-brain barrier because it seems to be involved with the hypothalamus, which regulates your appetite and your reward centres. And there is the effect on addictive behaviour in mind. So does it cross the blood-brain barrier and affect directly your brain?
So this is an area where at first they didn't think it crossed the blood-brain barrier, but it was more acting on nerves that go into your brain and activating that reward centre and also activating the hypothalamus to give you better regulation of body systems. But there is research now suggesting that maybe it does cross the blood-brain barrier, but this is like a new focus for these GLP-1s. The reason why there's so much intense interest, Dr. Karl, is because of the other anecdotal evidence around other addictions. These are very new classes of drugs. So when drugs come on the market, they go through all these rigorous multi-center international trials, highly, highly controlled. They check the results for safety. Do they work? And then eventually they get approved by the drug authority bodies in each country. So once they're approved for prescription, then the next lot of interesting results comes from, well, what's happening now that they're being used in the real world? That's why now we're getting these reports of, oh, I'm not seeing food in my environment anymore, the food noise. And there are some other reports of people saying, I actually am not drinking as much alcohol. Well, they're all addictive type behaviours. What about other addictions? Most of the research on actual addictions like drug addiction, for example, and even alcohol are in animal studies. But this is like a watch this space. There are people here in Australia at the Florey Institute who are doing some research on this, but it's too early to make a call. But for people who are taking these medications, it's really important to be aware of it may or may not have an effect on other addictive behaviours, and for GPs to watch this space and monitor that, as well as other factors like mental health, because that's your brain again.
So what about the gambling addiction? Now that's kind of an anecdotal or rock solid?
Yeah, it's anecdotal. So I was at the Australian New Zealand Obesity Conference recently, and there's a specialty group of GPs now who are specialising in treatment for severe obesity, and they work with endocrinologists and bariatric surgeons and other doctors to try and improve weight-related health for people who are living in larger bodies at the severe end of obesity. And it was really interesting because we were having a conversation about this phenomena of other addictions, and that they'd all had experiences of people like, not gambling as much, not shopping as much if they had a shopping addiction, or cutting down on alcohol, quit smoking. A couple of them said, but they'd also seen patients anecdotally where some of those other addictive behaviours actually got worse while they were treating it. I searched high and low in the literature to see if I can find anything about exacerbating, and there's nothing there. But I think it's really important to raise awareness among people that, while there's more reports saying there's a spillover effect on helping with other addictions, there are now some anecdotal stories of making them worse, but there's no recommendations around that other than just to be aware and monitor all of your health behaviours when you're starting on these medications, whether it be for type 2 diabetes or for severe obesity.
Okay, so these GLP-1 glucagon-like peptide-1 RA receptor agonist. They're newish. So a bit of background to that. So firstly, the plural of anecdote is anecdotes, not data. So we acknowledge that they're anecdotes, but following on from that, they can lead to further hard findings later on, but we're still in the early stages. And secondly, Paracelsus said this 500 years ago, all drugs are poisons. What matters is the dose. So there can be differing effects in different people. So, for example, you know the drug codeine. Codeine is inactive and doesn't work as a drug by itself. But 90% of us have the enzyme that'll turn codeine into morphine, and it works. But 10% do not, and either it doesn't work for them at all, or it does work because of the placebo effect. So this is part of the complex situation we're dealing with this drug, which appears to have effects on behaviour.
Yeah, and so that really got me then looking, well, are there any other potential harms that also relate to your brain? And pretty early on, when the drugs were first released for prescription, they were more available in the US, so a lot of information came from the US. There was a concern around increased risk of depression or suicidal ideation. And they went back and looked at the trials, because this is super important to be aware of if this is the case. And the clinical trial said, no, there is no increased risk. Just released in October in Nature is a paper that's actually looked at the cohort who are now using these medications. And they think that there is an increased risk of adverse mental health outcomes for a small group of people. And again, their advice is watch mental health as well, because there may be some people whose brains are more susceptible to adverse mental health and or suicidal ideation. And some of the factors they triggered in that, and what they pointed out rightly, is that all those big fancy trials around the world, they excluded people if they had a mental health condition. Yeah, so now they're being used more widely. Some of the people using them will have pre-existing mental health conditions. So it was a really good reminder that once drugs are being used just routinely in primary care practice, to follow the person's overall health. But these were the other things that they alerted, is that more likely at higher doses. So here's something for people to know. Wegovy, we said earlier, the active drug is called semaglutide. Both of them are injection, whether it's used as Ozempic for type 2 diabetes or Wegovy for treating severe obesity. Both of them start with the same low dose. And then, because when you inject someone with this long-acting chemical, like we saw the lizard who then doesn't eat for a week, you actually feel a bit sick. Your stomach doesn't empty. Yeah, you feel full, you feel hungry, and you can imagine, like, if you're a lizard and you got a tummy full of food and you're not going to eat for a week, you don't feel crash hot. So they start with a very low dose, help people get used to the symptoms, grade them up. Well, for severe obesity, the dose is higher. The maximum dose for diabetes is 2 milligrams. It's 2.4, so nearly 25% higher. So they put in an alert in this article to say higher dose medication, and interestingly, longer treatment period, it may be more risk for adverse mental health symptoms there. So they're just alerts. I think it's good for people to know the good and the bad. And while the biggest short-term positive is this loss of food noise, it's important to have a think about whether there may be other effects, and keep going back to see your GP. Keep going back to check in.
And with regard to this food noise, would it be amenable to something like cognitive behaviour therapy or psychological treatment, or am I barking up the wrong tree?
That is an absolutely fantastic question, because I'm going to tell you two answers to that. So with my team, we've been actually looking at what happens to people's dietary patterns when they're taking these medications. And interestingly, there's not a lot of research on it, but in the surveys of people who've been on the medications, they report eating heaps healthier and that it's easier to eat more healthy. But what is noted is that people feel they need less cognitive behavioural therapy when they're taking these medications. So it's very likely that it's because you don't need to have something planned ahead that you're going to do when pizza starts calling your name, because pizza's not calling your name anymore. So that's a positive. But for the group of people who are going, hey, I get food noise and I am not on those medications, that's lots of people experience it. So I think the positive of the discussion about food noise is people are now going, hey, that happens to me. Is there something I can do about it? And there is. And I created an acronym. I wrote an article for The Conversation called 6 Tips for Losing Weight Without Fad Diets. And I found this cue reactivity or food noise so fascinating that I made up an acronym for what the science says, the psychological science says, on how to take out that food noise and you beat it rather than letting it control you. And the acronym's called ROAR, R-O-A-R, and you might want to put 2 R's on the end. So I'm going to tell you what it means. So the first R is remind yourself that you're the boss, that this is a food cue talking. It's not you. Recognize that it's a food cue or that it's food noise. Initially, buy yourself some time by resisting the tempting food or drink. Just turn your back on it.
Really? So remind yourself you're the boss, you're in charge.
Roar back. You're the boss. You're going to remind yourself, and then you're going to resist the temptation just microseconds by turning your back on the food noise. Now, a key thing if you're going to roar back at food noise is to have a pre-organised alternative behaviour. That's your O and your R.
The organised.
Yeah, because psychology says if you can divert yourself from food noise getting a stranglehold, you will win. But the pre-organised alternatives, it's all that stuff. Phone a friend, walk the other way, grab a drink of water, check the messages on your phone, take a walk in the opposite direction. Diversion absolutely works. So breaking that automatic giving into the food noise controlling you. And then the next R is when you turn your back, it gives you a chance to reflect on your big picture goal. And so your big picture goal, it might be, I want my diabetes to improve, or I really want to feel better in myself. So that's the last thing, because the way the food noise works is it makes you give into immediate reward, immediate pleasure. So that last R is remembering that big picture goal. And, as I said, for some people it's about feeling better in themselves, but for some people it's actually about reducing other medications. You're really working on your health because you don't want to have to take as many medications. Maybe you want your blood pressure to improve, or maybe you do want to manage your weight. But in the work that we do, we find that a really high motivating factor for a lot of people is to feel better, like to feel like they're living their best life. And now, Karl, there was one more R. So if you want to roar with 2 R's at the end, some evidence for financial incentives. Doesn't work for every people. So every time you roar back at that food noise, if you drop a gold coin into a money box or something like that, something physical, then when you've saved up, take yourself to the movies or buy the new dress or get the new pair of shoes, whatever it is, because that helps you key into that longer term goal. That's kind of like an intermediate goal. So when the food noise has got you by the short and curly, implement the R, drop a coin into the box and go, yep, I'm going to win because I so want those new joggers or new book or whatever it is. But whether or not you're on those medications, you can start dealing with food noise now. And I think it's fabulous that we're discussing it, because I think it was something that sciencey people were keeping to ourselves and not really talking about it, but everyone's talking about it now.
I'd never heard of this food noise before. Well, thank you so much, Professor Clare from the University of Newcastle.
And thank you, Dr. Karl. It's been a great chat.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Shirtloads of Science is washed, spun and aired by the University of Sydney.